Hey, this is the Z06 Baron, and today we're going to cover all of the common issues with this C6 Corvette. And I see a lot of people on YouTube, they cover like 4 or 5 common problems with the C6, which are correct and very common. But I'm going to cover over 25 different very common issues, some worse than others. But first off, I'll start with the really bad ones that are very common that you really have to address and that are very expensive to address. And then I'll kind of dive down into some of the cheaper ones that are a nuisance or a pain, but you'll still get home driving the car. Also, in this video, all of the things we cover, I want to say that this vehicle overall most of these major issues can be fixed, and you can get it to the point where the vehicle is reliable. I'm not saying you should never buy this vehicle. I am saying that if you've never worked on a car, or if you don't have a ton of money and time to wait for the dealership to fix it, which I have less faith in than my own ability, especially if you've worked on a car, then this isn't the car for you, you know? A lot of these issues you can go through and fix. You can clean the grounds, you can replace this part, you can replace the valves, and then the vehicle will be pretty consistently reliable as long as you're not treating it like crap and you take care of it. I just want to make that clear in this video. Now, part of this video I want to preface this by saying I kind of term a reliable vehicle that goes 200 to 250,000 miles without major issues, such as your engine should last 250,000 miles without major issues. Your transmission, if you have a water pump go out at 180,000 miles, that's not a big deal. If it goes out at 60,000 miles, that's kind of more of a bigger deal. So that's kind of my preface. Granted, this is a sports car. This is a very fast car. It's driven hard in most cases, but that doesn't give an excuse for some of the issues on this car. So we're going to start out with some of the major ones first off. So Z06 in particular, not the LS3 or LS2, the Z06 exhaust valves. I know that's a super common one, most everyone knows about that, but the exhaust valves are poorly manufactured and they tend to break and they total the engine when they fall into the cylinder while it's running. Very common problem. If you have a Z06 Corvette, a C6 Z06 Corvette, immediately take it and get at least the exhaust valves replaced. The alternator. These cars, if you have 100,000 miles on them, you probably have replaced the alternator already. Now, an alternator, a starter, a fuel pump, that's one of those things in my book that should last 200,000 miles without you having any issues. It's lasted 200,000 and more miles on my Toyota, on my 2010 Dodge Ram. My OEM alternator lasted 250,000 miles. Alternator, starter, those are things that shouldn't go out under 200K in my book, you know. So an alternator is a big one, very common problem that you're probably gonna have to replace at some point. The starter as well is more common with these cars, not as bad as the alternator. Another huge one, the fuel tank leaks and the hoses break on them and you have a very bad fuel smell. Extremely common problem. If you have a C6 Corvette, and if you've never had this issue, you're gonna have this issue at some point. Fuel sensors go out. It's not an if, it's not, some of them do, all of them will go out at some point. Very commonly, especially it's 2022, most C6 Corvettes on the older, 2005 to 2010 at 80,000 or more miles, especially depending on how much fuel you've had and what condition they're in. The probes, the little fingers that touch on the gauge inside of the reservoir, they start to corrode, they give out, and you're gonna have this issue. And let me tell you, the hardest job I've ever done on a car is replacing the fuel pump on a C6 Corvette. It's a total pain. Another huge one is electrical issues. You hear a lot of people talking about the C5s and having grounding issues and electrical issues. Let me tell you, the C6 isn't drastically better. It's probably a decent amount better. You're gonna have electrical issues no matter what. Another big one that's kind of with that in hand is the traction control, or service the traction control or active handling. That's a very common light that comes on. That's often related to electrical issues. Very common. Usually, like I would say 70 to 80% of the time it's related to an electrical issue. And I mean electrical issues by bad grounds, not a very clean surface, metal to metal contact on grounds, loose terminals, the fuse box wires give out and crack and break. The battery charging, alternator charging, all of that gives out. Your alternator goes out and then your battery goes bad because it wasn't charging. That's another big issue with the C6 Corvettes you're gonna face no matter what. Electrical issues. On the manual transmissions on these cars, the clutch return is terrible. It's not necessarily a clutch issue, it's not really a master cylinder issue, it's not really a spring issue, it's just kind of or it's not really a fluids issue. If you replace the fluid in the clutch, it'll get better. No, it's just a poor design on the clutch return spring and the clutch master cylinder. It's undersized, it's not reliable, it doesn't push back out. And so on a lot of higher mileage vehicles, even if they're well maintained like this one, I replace the clutch fluid. It has a stock clutch in it, and 90,000 miles, and the clutch sometimes fails to return, the clutch pedal fails to return to its full state. Very common issue. I've met 7 or 8 people with manual transmission C6 Corvettes, like 9 out of 10 have that issue. And it's something where you can get an aftermarket return spring for like $80. I replaced the OEM clutch spring, didn't help. I think if you replace the master cylinder, replace the fluid, went through everything, it would probably fix it temporarily, and then 80,000 miles, it'd do the same thing. It's just a poor design. It's not something that, is gonna break your clutch or like is a huge issue. It's just a little pesky thing that if you're not careful and if it doesn't return, you got to make sure you got another spring on there, and it's gonna happen. It's not like, oh, some of them have it. No, yours will eventually have it if you have a manual transmission. It will. A huge issue with the C6 Corvettes is the harmonic balancer. Very common problem on the C6 Corvettes. Depends on the years. I think the newer ones, it's not as frequent. Pretty straightforward fix, hard to get to. It's gonna cost you parts and doing it yourself at least $600-700. Very, 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 very common issue on the C6. On the LS3s, on the Z06, all of them. The LS3 timing chain tensioner. This is a pretty common issue. I'd say maybe like 10 to 30% of the LS3s have this issue. Also, I think this is dependent on how well maintained. If you've replaced your oil consistently and on time, you probably won't have this issue as much. But a lot of them do have that issue. Not major. It's not as bad as the Z06 valve issue, but it's an issue. Now, that finishes it for the main big issues with the Corvette that cost thousands of dollars, could blow up your engine. It's gonna happen no matter what. The rest of these issues I'll kind of touch off on how common these are. Some are more common than others. But anyway, that's about what I just covered, was about like a quarter of the list. So here's the rest of the issues with the C6. The door switches, the buttons on the doors, the motors that open up the doors, the motors in the window units going up and down, those are all things that sometimes can go out. And it's one of those things in my head, a 20-year-old car with 200,000 miles should never have a window motor go out. You run it maybe a couple thousand times in its lifetime, that's something that should never go out. You should never have an issue with it, and these cars sometimes have those issues. Not super common, not terrible to replace, but it's gonna happen, and if you had a Toyota, probably wouldn't happen. The cheap plastics on this car, so bad. This is one of those that's very, very, very common. You're gonna have an issue with, but not like a major issue. Like you can still drive home if your plastic breaks in this one area. But cheap plastics, the fog light brackets, the upper portions of those crack, they break sometimes, they fall over. Mine had it happen. The cup holder cover broke, totally disintegrated, fell apart. The mirrors that fold down from the sun visors, those covers crack and break and fall off. Mine did it. When you open them, they squeak and they're really stiff. They're just cheap, poorly engineered, crappy plastic. The center console compartment that opens and closes, threading on those bolts got loose and broke and totally disintegrated. I had to open the whole thing up and put a nut and bolt, which they should have had on the first place, and that fixed the issue. I mean, you put your arm on it a lot, you move it around when you're getting out of the car, you push so it moves back and forth, and eventually the plastic in there on those screws gets loose and they lose the threads and they break and it falls off. Not a huge issue, are pretty easy to fix and a pretty common issue. There's other plastic issues in the car that break. Really anything that moves a lot or you touch a lot, it's very subject to break in the car. If you're taking out a panel and you're really pushing on it, it might break. Like, be very careful with the plastics in this car. Front tire uneven wear, pretty common on the C6s. I've heard that if you get a correct alignment, it fixes this. It seems like a lot of them from the factory or that don't have an alignment, they tend to wear more on the inside. Short issue. The older C6 Corvettes, some of them have an issue shifting from drive or neutral to park or out of park. A lot of the older automatic transmissions have that issue. Flaky AC computer. So the automatic AC, you set it to 84 degrees and it's blowing 73 degrees, or it sometimes just turns off, or it's flaky. I haven't heard of a lot of issues where people just can't get it to work at all, but it's a common thing that goes out, or it's mainly just flaky. It sometimes works or sometimes turns off, but usually you can get it to work. It's just kind of pain in the ass. The shifter knob on the manual and automatic transmissions deteriorates, it falls apart, the leather around it gets loose, it starts to ooze out whatever caulking or sealant is inside to give it some texture. Very common. I've had that issue on this car for a while. It's got 90K, it's a 2008. The center, now this isn't necessarily a major issue, but it's a very common thing that's uncomfortable and alarming and not okay. The center row, everything underneath your transmission where the drive axle goes through, underneath that is your exhaust. That whole thing, when you put your arm next to it, it gets bloody hot. And if it's under 78 degrees and you're not in traffic, it's just a little bit warm, you don't really notice it. But when it's hot outside and it's only 90, 95 degrees, and you're doing some spirited driving or you get stuck in a little bit of traffic, that whole thing gets hot to the point where I pulled out a wrench from the center console and I had to lay it down because it was so hot to the touch. That's pretty bad. And it's not like it's missing insulation, it just gets super hot. I think it's a combination of the drive axle and the exhaust and lack of insulation. That's just shitty, that sucks. You shouldn't have to deal with that. I get it being warm on some days, but being hot to the touch to where you can hardly put your hand on it, that's not okay. Some of these catch on fire and you wonder why. The front wheel bearings, that's pretty common with a lot of trucks and vehicles these days. I had a truck that was really reliable at 150K, one went out the driver's side, and then the passenger side front went out at like 190K. That's pretty common. If it happens before 150K, that's kind of shitty on a vehicle. It's not like a huge issue, they're pretty easy to replace, but kind of a common issue. Not a big deal though on these cars. That's pretty common for a lot of cars to have that issue. The oil pressure sensor on these cars frequently go out. I think this is an issue more with the older C6s, but they'll show 100 PSI or 0 PSI and you have to replace the sensor. I don't think it's too bad to get to them, but something I wanted to mention. The headlights fogging and cracking and getting, cracking along the edges and fogging up over time, pretty common issue with these cars. So something you gotta replace eventually, and that looks pretty bad. Cracking rear glass. So on the rear window, the heater lines that go across, I've got a crack in mine, and online if you read that sometimes when you're closing it or you turn on the heater over time that you'll have a crack appear on that back glass. So pretty common issue on that. The master cylinder on these things sometimes go out. Now, a lot of people have this issue when they're replacing the clutch. They don't replace the master cylinder, or they screw something up, or they never replace the fluid and it eventually kind of gives out, but something I wanted to mention. The rims peeling, paint, chipping, especially on the chrome ones, pretty common issue with the Corvettes. I've got a bunch of little marks and graying where the chrome has peeled off or starting to fade or look pretty crappy. I wish they had just made some sort of aluminum that didn't happen over time like that, but very common issue. Body panel fitment, especially on the front bumper on these things, there's parts that over time when they get hot they start to stick up a little bit. These two little tips on both sides have that issue, and even on the 2022 Corvettes they're having body panel issues, so not super uncommon for Chevrolet. Cooling issues, the radiator fan burns up on some of these cars. They run pretty hot and it's a very aerodynamic vehicle. And I think on some of the newer C8s, they have a portion of the radiator where the fog lights are in this car. And that can be necessary on a high horsepower, low to the ground car of how you cool it. So yeah, that's an issue that sometimes happens with these cars, is the radiator fan burns up, it runs pretty hot, and it gets hotter and hotter and hotter in traffic, and you're like, I know on mine, after like 205 degrees, the AC just goes out. The compressor appears to be working fine. I don't think it's an electrical issue. I think the ECU turns off the compressor to reduce heat buildup on the engine and the coolant system when it gets too hot, and that happens every time after 90 degrees and I'm sitting in traffic. It's kind of sucky. There's no easily accessible clutch bleed on the car, and there's an aftermarket one where you can route it up into the engine bay. All of the C6s should have that, and they don't, and you have to lift up the car to do normal maintenance and bleed your fluid on the clutch. That's stupid. That's not a good design. Burning oil. Even if your car is stock with under 100k miles, these cars burn oil. Some more than others, depending on how you drive them and what condition they're in, and if you make sure and check your oil. But these cars burn oil, especially when you have more aftermarket stuff and you're pushing more horsepower. It's just very common on these cars, and if you're not careful and you don't check your oil, you can blow up your engine. So definitely something to know. Very common thing with these, even stock, 100,000 miles, they burn a lot of oil. I know mine, under medium to hard acceleration, burns about a quart every 500 to 1,000 miles, which is a lot. On my truck, it was doing that at 250,000 miles. This is a performance car, but it kind of sucks. The doors opening and closing. The system where you press the button on the inside to open these doors, and when you're in the car and you press the button, sometimes if you don't press it long enough, they flake out and you can't open it fully. They're just kind of pesky, not a huge issue. The stepper motors on those that open and close don't often go out, but damn it, Chevrolet, why not just make that mechanical latch? That's just silly. They have the mechanical latches at where the footwell is down at the bottom in case the battery goes out or something's not working. But also in the car, if you're driving around, you pull over, you leave the car running, put on the brake, you can't press and open the doors. I don't know why. You have to reach down and grab the mechanical. It's like sometimes, I want to check something on my engine, because it's a shitty Chevrolet, and I get out or try and get out and the button won't work, so I have to do the mechanical thing. The seat motor's giving out. The seats on these things are okay. I don't personally have a whole lot of issues with them. They're a little bit loose though, I will say that. You can move them a little bit back and forward when you're stopping and accelerating. Sometimes you can kind of feel it pop a little bit. Not the best seats. And then the motors, every single time you open the door on some of the higher models, it'll pull the seat back, to have easier access in and out of the car. I would prefer it not to do that. I would rather all those motors and the electronics behind that not do anything and preserve the life of them when I actually need to adjust the seat. and that's not something that you can easily turn off. So pesky, small, not big of a deal issue, but yeah. The airbag light on specifically the driver's side, pretty common issue. I'm mentioning the driver's seat going back and forth. You wonder why. There's a wire in there that gives out or gets loose and then causes the airbag light to come on. Very common on the C6s is a driver's side airbag light because there's a wire loose on the driver's side. The steering position and gas pedal feedback sensor and other sensors and electronics on the car have been known to give out. Not extremely common, might be related to electrical issues, but thought I would mention. Key fob issues. Key fobs are flaky, don't always work right. Sometimes you press the button and under certain scenarios they just don't work, or yeah, you replace the battery and they're still sometimes flaky. Not a very common issue. I think on the 08s and up they're pretty consistent and not a ton of issues. Leather ripping and cracking, pretty common for a lot of cars, but on the C6s the leather as it ages cracks and rips and gives out, but not a huge issue. Water pump. Water pumps, pretty common with most higher mileage cars over 150, 200K. I know on my Dodge it went out at 190K on that truck. The Toyota Corolla hasn't gone out. I think after 150K it's a pretty common issue. On the C6s it's usually earlier. 50, 70, 80, 90K they'll give out. Not extremely common, but sometimes happens. Sway bar links, the rubber bushings, again, like the plastics, poor quality control. The parts on these things just don't last as long as Toyota or Honda does on some of these. The glove box lock breaks. So if you use that a lot, or if it sits, or if it's older plastic, and sometimes you use it maybe a little aggressively and it cracks and it breaks, again, like all the other plastics on this car. The driver's side heated seat very commonly goes out. It's something that, not a big deal. I mean, unless you're in colder environments, you don't really need that, but I haven't fixed it on this car. I have that issue where I try and turn it on, doesn't turn on. The passenger side works, but not the driver's side. Again, I think that's having to do with the seat moving back and forth every single time you get in and out, which I wish you could just turn off. I think you can pull a fuse, which I need to investigate on this car. There's a popping noises from the roof when it gets hot. I've heard this more on the Target tops that are removable. When they're cool and then they heat up from sun exposure, sometimes you'll hear popping as things expand. A bigger issue is water leaking from those. The sealant and the silicone or whatever it gives out after a time. I know some of the seals on this car I've visually seen that they're cracking or they're breaking in some areas, or they're pulling up. Very common on the C6s. Not a huge issue until it starts pouring water into your car. The heads-up display sometimes gives out, it has issues. Not a huge issue. Sometimes on long road trips I turn it off because I don't want that showing, but thought I would mention. Anyway, I think that about does it. Thanks for being patient. I know this video is probably going to be long, but I think it's going to be very informational. And all of that, surmising everything, I would recommend this car more towards someone who knows how to work on a car, or you have a ton of money and time that you can take it to the dealer and have them address it. Even then though, I've heard stories of taking the car to the dealer and they don't really know what they're doing, or there's technicians there that just aren't very knowledgeable about these cars. So if you don't know how to work on a car or diagnose electrical issues, then it's probably not the car for you. But I think keeping in mind that the C6 Corvette is bought for a few reasons. One is power to weight ratio is ludicrous. With some bolt-ons on the LS3 and Z06, they keep up with Hellcats. That's awesome. And price point, they're cheaper. And parts availability is not too bad. You can get parts for these pretty easily. Anyway, I make this video not to shit on the car, not to convince you never to buy this car because I hate it. No, that's not the point. It's that a lot of vehicles in the 2000s, not just Chevrolet, but Dodge and Ford, had lots of quality control issues, and a lot of people don't really talk about them because this isn't an extremely common car, and a lot of people just drive it on the weekends and it's babied and garage kept. But if you drive it like a daily, or it has higher mileage, you're gonna run into these issues and you need to know about them before you buy the car. It's not a reason to not buy it, but it's something to consider before getting it. Now, looking back, would I say this car is unreliable and you should never get it? No. A lot of these issues are things that you can address and rectify and make better or live with, you know? If you clean up your grounds, if you go through your electrical system, if you spend a good 2 or 3 hours checking on things and making sure everything's healthy, then you can prevent several of these issues, especially with the electronics, and your car is going to be a lot more reliable. You know, the Z06 exhaust valves, if you get them replaced, well then that issue's fixed. The alternator, if you replace it before it even goes out, that issue's fixed. If you clean up your grounds and make sure they have good metal-to-metal contact, you don't have to deal with a lot of these issues. So it's not like I'm saying this car is unreliable, but if you do due diligence on the car, then you can make this a good, reliable, for the most part, car. Also, one other thing I wanted to point out as far as electrical issues is every single ground that I have removed from this car, which I assume is factory, and from what I've seen on other videos is factory, it's painted. Everyone knows that any sort of grounding or electrical connection, metal to metal, not metal to paint. Whatever connection that bolts to the surface needs to be exposed metal, and then once you connect it, you can paint around it to prevent it from rusting. But every single ground, you know, the 6 or 7 out of 11 or 12 grounds that I have pulled off, the metal that it touches is painted over. And I've had many instances of electrical issues with this car, and I've only owned it for less than 6 months and maybe put on 6,000 miles on it, and I intend to keep it for a long time and to give an update as it goes. But that's one thing, this car, like when you first get it, no matter what, the first thing you should do is just go through all of the grounds, clean them up, make sure they're torqued, make sure there's no corrosion. Another thing on these boxes, the fuse box, the terminals and the connections and the wiring tend to get loose, and the relays and the fuses where they plug in, those little forks that the fuse plugs into, they get wider and they span out with heat, and they start to lose connection and cause all of these issues where you're like, oh my gosh, my ECU is going out, or this one sensor is going out, when in reality, it's a loose connection somewhere. I cannot tell you how common that problem is with the C6s. So if you go through, you clean up all your grounds, you pull the fuse box, you tighten some of those connections, those little forks that the fuses plug in, if you get a needle nose plier and gently push them in to where they have a tighter connection, you'll fix a lot of those issues. The ground and positive terminals on the battery were a little bit loose when I got the car. I had to tighten them down, and I had issues with that. It wouldn't start. It would throw the traction control light, and it would be in limp mode, and then it was just a loose ground connection or a loose positive connection. Super common with these cars. And if you know about that, and if you check everything, or if you have an issue and immediately diagnose the electrical issue, you'll be better off.